Friends, welcome back for another Q&A this week. So this week we've got 4 really solid questions here, but the fourth one's kind of a two-parter, so that's going to be my 5 questions this week, all right? So the first one, is the fatigue from neutral grip hammer curls, is that worth it? So neutral grip curls, is the fatigue from that worth it, or should you just do supinated to avoid some of that fatigue that might come with your forearms and stuff like that from neutral grip curls? So I think that if your forearms are limiting your sets rather than your biceps, then 100% go to using grips or wrist wraps, or even playing around with just doing more supinated curls so your forearms aren't the limiting factor of your bicep sets. I think that is a good idea. But if you're talking about looking at your systemic fatigue and you're worried that your systemic fatigue from neutral grip curls is going to be a ton more than supinated just because your forearms are getting a little bit more fatigue, while that absolutely could be true, I think that difference in systemic fatigue is going to be so small to where this is just a detail that's probably not worth worrying about, all right? So make sure that your biceps are actually your limiting factor on your curls. So, hey, if you've got to wear wrist wraps, or if that means you do a little bit more supinated curls, I think that's absolutely fine, but I wouldn't necessarily do it from a systemic recovery standpoint, all right? Second question. Biggest mistake I've made fitness-wise. Yeah, this one's an easy one for me. Not spending enough time eating enough food and actually growing muscle. Like, I've been lifting for a long time now, probably several years, and I would say my first 3 or 4 years, I probably spent a total of like 2 months not in a deficit, And that's not great. Although, I did start at a not great body fat percentage, but I think that I could have easily just had one of those years been fat loss and then actually spend the rest of the time growing. And I think that what really tripped me up is thinking that I had to have abs in order to go through a gaining phase, or else I wasn't lean enough and my P ratio wouldn't be good. The ratio of fat to muscle I gained wouldn't be good. And I think that while in general, it's probably a good idea to get fairly lean before going through a gaining phase to give yourself enough kind of runway to gain without getting uncomfortable. I think that as long as you're under a healthy body fat percentage, so for guys, maybe around 20%, as long as you're under that range, and females maybe add several percentage points to that, I don't think that you need to be at like 10% to go through a gaining phase. I think if you feel more comfortable at like 13 to 15%, which I do, then maybe you just rotate your gaining phases within 13 to 17 or 18%. And that's still like pretty lean depending on your body fat distribution and stuff like that. And that's another thing I didn't consider as well, as my personal body fat distribution, like my arms and my shoulders and even like my legs stay pretty lean. It just all goes right to my midsection, And if that's the case for somebody, then the rule of thumb of I need to have abs to go through a gaining phase, if they have that less favorable body fat distribution and they feel more comfortable at maybe a little bit higher of a settling range, then they're almost never going to be at that point to where they can go through gaining phases, because when they have abs, they're probably like a little bit below their settling point to where they feel good. But once they start feeling good, they no longer have abs. And then they're caught in that cycle. And I was definitely caught in that cycle. And it just took me time to realize, hey, you're still lean. Like, you're still within a healthy body fat range for guys. And you can absolutely kind of fluctuate within a range to where maybe you don't quite have abs all the time, but it still doesn't look like sloppy, And I think that taking that approach to where, okay, you find the lower end of the body weight or a body weight range to where you feel good. For me, it's like once I dip below 170 pounds and I'm 5'10", once I go below that, training starts to not feel as good. I feel a little bit more frail in the gym and stuff like that. And then on the flip side, once I get above like 185, 190, start pushing up there, then I start getting a lot more uncomfortable with how I'm looking. So I kind of fluctuate within that 15, 20 pound range. And over time, hopefully that range looks better and better. And that's kind of how I approach it. Now, if I wanted to get like, if I had a holiday or something coming up to where I wanted to be especially lean, then I would probably dip below that 170 maybe, or I'll just get down to 170 and I feel pretty comfortable there. But if I wanted to take it further, I would for a short period of time, but then I would get back up into that range that feels good for me. So number one mistake, not spending enough time eating food, because I really thought that I had to have abs to go through gaining phases. And I just don't think that's the case. I think that if you're within a healthy body fat range and you're paying attention to kind of your entire body fat, how it's kind of distributed on average, then I absolutely think that you can go through gaining phases within 15, 20%. And I really don't see it having a huge impact on your P ratio and stuff like that. Like you're lifting weights, you're eating enough protein, you're probably pretty active. I'm really not worried about that, assuming you're within kind of a healthy body fat range. All right. So that was definitely my number one mistake, and definitely something I think that people fall into, especially people with a history of being overweight in the past, maybe less favorable settling points and maybe less favorable body fat distributions. All right. So if that's you, find that range that you feel good in. Don't think that you have to be lean all the time. And as long as you're within a healthy body fat range and you're not super uncomfortable with your body fat. Now, don't get me wrong. There's times to where I think that you kind of have to go through those gaining phases to where you're a little uncomfortable with your body fat to put on that muscle. So then when you get down to the lower end of that range, you feel a lot better. And the best way to make a body fat percentage look better is putting on muscle. And sometimes you just have to go through that initial phases. But once you do, it definitely pays off. All right. So hope that helps. Next question, thoughts on starting a fat loss phase aggressive and then slowing down the rate? I think absolutely. I think that this is probably the route that I default to that makes the most sense. I think that when you start a fat loss phase, you're probably not quite as lean. And when you're not quite as lean, you don't risk muscle loss as much by pushing that pace a little bit more. And you can really get the ball rolling, get some momentum going. This tends to improve adherence for people. Starting out a little bit faster, they see, oh, I'm actually seeing results. I can stick to this. I can keep going. I really like what I'm seeing. And that can improve adherence. So I think starting out a little bit snappy. Does anybody say snappy? Just me. But starting out a little bit quicker rate definitely makes sense. And I also think that as the leaner you get, you probably want to pull that back a little bit, because you're going to risk a little bit of muscle loss if you keep pushing that pace as hard as you can while you get leaner and while you have less kind of adipose tissue to lose there. All right. So I definitely think in your fat loss phases, I would default most scenarios. Let's push this pace a little bit more early on. And then the leaner we get, we can slow that rate of loss down a little bit. I generally like to see somewhere between 1% to 0.5% of body weight per week. So at the start of a fat loss phase, we might really shoot for that 1% per week. And then as we move towards the end, it's going to creep more towards that 0.5%. All right. And it's not going to be linear like this every week. Like I've got clients to where it will stick for 2 weeks and then we'll drop 2 pounds, and then they'll stick for 2 weeks, drop 2 pounds. Pay attention to those kind of bi-weekly averages, monthly averages, and that sort of thing. All right. And the final kind of 2-part question. So thoughts on reverse dieting after cutting, and then also thoughts on maintenance phases following a fat loss phase. So kind of the same question here. So as for reverse dieting, I think that depending on how lean somebody got, it can be a reasonable thing to do after a diet, and depending on someone's goals. If someone gets down to maybe just the lower end of their settling point, they feel pretty lean, they feel good, and they just want to maintain that, then I see no problem with kind of, okay, let's start slowly creeping those calories up. Let's keep you pretty lean, but let's also start trying to add that food back in. I think that's reasonable. Now, if someone dips below their settling range and they're really not feeling good, they have a lot of food focus, stuff like that, then I think that reverse dieting, it's just delaying the amount of time that it's going to take you to get back to a place to where you're healthy and you can start making progress again in your training. So if you get really lean for a photo shoot and stuff like that, I think that there's no amount of reverse dieting that you can do that's going to get you back to a healthy level before needing to put some body fat back on. So I think that while you're kind of in that danger zone below your body fat settling point, I wouldn't mess around with reverse dieting, and I would add calories back a little bit more assertively, get a little bit of that weight coming back on over time. Like, it doesn't have to be overnight, but making sure that we see that scale increase at least to some degree, depending on how low below your settling point you went. And then you can start kind of taking a slower approach and easing out of it a little bit more. And you know, that initial phase where you're gaining that body fat back, it's definitely not going to feel great because you're comparing yourself to where you were previously, which was probably as lean as you've ever been. And when you put body fat back on after a kind of hard diet like that, or when you put weight back on, usually a lot of it is body fat because your body is just kind of ready to put body fat back on, and your sex hormones are probably in a less favorable situation to where we're probably more primed to put fat back on rather than muscle. So it might not look great that first 5 or 6 pounds you put back on, but over time, it has a way of kind of evening itself out and it will look better. You just kind of have to trust it and it will get better there. All right. So I wouldn't reverse diet if you are kind of in that danger zone, but if you just get to the lower end of your settling point, you want to kind of maintain it, but work calories back up. I think that a slower kind of a reverse dieting is reasonable. All right. And then as for maintenance phases, I'm generally a fan of maintenance phases after fat loss phases. Like, if it's only a 4 to 6 week mini cut, I don't think that you really need a maintenance phase. But if we start getting that 10, 12, 14 weeks, then I like to slot one kind of maintenance phase after a fat loss phase in most situations. And I like this because, for one, it really helps you drop any kind of diet fatigue that you had in that fat loss phase. And by dropping that diet fatigue, maybe getting your hormones back in check a little bit, maybe reducing any training fatigue that you accumulated throughout your diet and all that stuff, it just sets you up so much better for a gaining phase rather than jumping right to it. And I think that if you jump right to it, well, you might put yourself in a surplus, but then you're not fully recovered from your diet. So your training's probably maybe a little bit more mediocre. So maybe you have mediocre training with a surplus, and that's not probably always the best combination. So I do think that slotting at least a few weeks of maintenance after most fat loss phases is a good idea there. And then you can shift to a surplus, adding those calories back in a little bit more and more, and kind of slowly transitioning out of there depending on your goals. So for this question, reverse dieting, yes, if your goal is to kind of maintain your leanness and you're not kind of below your settling point. If you're below your settling point, I would bring calories up more assertively, gain some actual weight back, put yourself in a better place. And then as for maintenance phases in general after dieting, I think that if it's much longer than 6 or so weeks, I would have a 3 to 6 week kind of maintenance phase. And I would probably want to do that after every maybe 12 to 16 weeks of dieting to have one of those phases. All right. So I appreciate the questions. Thank you so much for tuning in. I do appreciate it. Can't believe people, take time out of their day to watch me on their YouTube channel. All right. So I appreciate it, guys. Have an awesome weekend. I guess it's Sunday right now, so have an awesome week ahead. Sometimes people don't like Sundays because it's like, oh, I got the full weekend. I actually kind of like Sundays. I don't know. I'm weird though. So that's all. See ya.